you're listening to the Primal Happiness Show, a podcast dedicated to helping you thrive in this crazy modern world. Every Tuesday, we explore the nature of how our minds really work, what exactly the human animal requires to thrive, and how we can live happier and more fulfilling lives. If you're new here and haven't yet taken our free class, then there's no better place to get a jump start on reclaiming your primal happiness. It's where we'll guide you step by step through our antidote to today's modern world. Simply head on over to primalhappiness.co/antidote to get the free class and discover how to thrive without having to move to a planet that's not so crazy as ours. But now, your host, Brook-Tyler.
Hello, my beautiful people. A huge warm welcome back to the show. In today's crazy modern world, men and women are living shallow, disconnected, and unfulfilling lives. So we created the path for those who are ready to reclaim their wildness and actualize their deepest gifts. And oh my goodness, this week has felt very much all about that. I began unraveling the body on Wednesday, so a couple of days ago, and already it's going so much deeper than I expected. It was something that just occurred to me women might be interested in, those that for whatever reason weren't ready or weren't able to join Wake the Wild Feminine. And that was a couple of months ago, I think, that I first came up with the idea and didn't really have a sense of what it would be about, but kind of opened it up anyway for enrollment. And it ended up being 28 women who felt drawn to this. So there's 28 women on this amazing journey. And already just kind of one live session in and them coming together in the Facebook group, could already see so much vulnerability, love, connection starting to grow. It is blowing me away. And it's really teaching me a lot about the stories I had around kind of certain kinds of, I guess, mediums and numbers of women going through a journey together and what would be possible. And it's making me completely not just rewrite those stories, but just drop them all together and just be present to actually what's happening and what is possible. So that has got me feeling so humble and also appreciative of what's possible and this mad journey the wild feminine is taking me on, and the women who just seem to hear the call and know that it's right for them and are so courageous about stepping onto this path. So yes, it's been a beautiful, beautiful week, and still 5 weeks of that to go. So I will no doubt share with you how that's going, particularly, I guess, in the next All the Everything. I'll be in a position to share much more with you then. But yes, so far, so gorgeous. And now on to this week's show. It's with the gorgeous Jess Heading. Jess is, oh my goodness, such a delight. I'm so pleased to share her with you. She's a life and leadership coach who supports women to heal their relationship with their bodies, reconnect with their inner wisdom, and unleash their radiant essence. Jess grew up hating her body and suffered from a binge eating disorder and bulimia for 15 years. Having reclaimed trust in her body's wisdom and signals and learned to partner with her body instead of controlling it, supporting other women on their journey to body acceptance and trust is now a key element of Jess's coaching work. So in this show, Jess and I spoke about the way this rupture has created an increasing trend of turning to emotional comfort eating, and there being this growing primal fear, or a primal fear that's already there but being made more prevalent, about there not being enough food. And that's been created by things like the sight of empty shelves and hear of people stockpiling. And simultaneously, there's this collective panic about what will our bodies look like at the end of this. Now, these are all things that are present to an extent at any time, but just like with so many other things right now, this is being so illuminated at this time. So, with all of this at play, how do we maintain a good body image during this time? And this was just such a loving, wise, and helpful show. Well worth listening to at any time, but I think especially now. Let's dive in. Hello, Jess. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Leanne. I'm so happy to be here.
Yeah, this feels really good. In fact, we kind of had to make ourselves hit record because we just had so much to talk about on this topic. I was like, do you know what? All of this could have actually just been the show. Let's just hit record. So yeah, clearly we both got a lot to say on this topic. You more than I, but it's, as you know, our relationship to our bodies and ultimately ourselves is something that I'm really passionate about too, albeit my experience isn't the same as your experience. But I feel like this is going to be such a juicy show.
Yeah, I'm really excited.
So let's start by you'd reached out to me suggesting we do a show on this topic because of what you were seeing being sort of created or driven up during this time around the whole thing around kind of emotional eating, body image. So do you want to just kind of lay that out first as our foundation and then just kind of see which sort of golden threads we want to pick from there?
Yeah, perfect. And yeah, I reached out because it's something I was noticing in myself. I was hearing from clients when I was coaching them. And I was just noticing on social media, talking to friends and colleagues, that it's driven up so much around our relationship to food, and namely that a lot of us are turning to food to soothe ourselves during this time. So there's a lot of talk about comfort eating and emotional eating, and a lot of jokes around the 100 trips to the kitchen that we're making each day. So there's a lot there around using food as a coping strategy during these really crazy times, and that makes a lot of sense because a lot of our usual coping strategies aren't available, aren't as accessible. There's lots of reasons why it makes sense that more of us are turning to food, or those of us that have always used food are using it even more.
Yes.
And then
sense.
we've got this that's one aspect of it.
Can
and
I
then
just stop you there and ask,
that,
can I just ask a couple of questions about that part first? Because I think, each of these are like big things in their own right, aren't they? That's worth kind of distilling. So I noticed that you say emotional and comfort eating. Is that just kind of like just how is there a reason you've sort of said and? Are they different things, or is it just two different words that kind of mean the same thing?
I think they are in some ways interchangeable, but I think probably comfort eating sits within the emotional eating bandwidth. So comfort would be one reason that we might eat. As part of the emotional range, there'll be other reasons within that we might turn to food. And I mean, we've been emotionally eating with food in celebration and community since the dawn of time. So emotion and food are connected, and they always have been. But obviously, we tend to say, well, it's okay that we've had a slice of birthday cake we didn't really feel like it to celebrate with a friend, or had a glass of champagne because it felt right to do so. But when we turn to food because we're feeling sad, or we need comfort, or we're feeling anxious, that feels wrong to us.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Yeah. And you're right. I mean, right from our babyhood, we can see just by watching a baby, they're not having their milk just for nutrition. You can see that, that beautiful look they get on their face of just like pure, like it's like ecstasy, isn't it? When they take that first milk, you can just see the whole body's just like, yes.
Exactly. Food is pleasure. That's what it's so sensual, and it's designed to be pleasurable. So there is emotion connected to food. We can't get rid of that, and it can show up in challenging ways for us because we can start to make that wrong in the way that we're connecting those two.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, I've got some other questions, but I'm going to hold those for a moment because I think we'll go dive deeper, but that will make sense so far. Right, okay, over to the next piece.
The next piece is that, and it's quite interesting that we're all sort of making all these jokes about and memes about how we're using food, and then alongside that, scrolling through, the next post on social media will be speaking to the collective panic that everyone seems to have about what their bodies are going to look like at the end of this pandemic. And there is a lot of quite frankly, fat phobic commentary, memes, things going around about how are we going to look at the end of this? What's my body going to look like? And, quite frankly, as someone that is I'm a plus size woman, I'm the before. I'm the usually the before in this situation, the after, oh my gosh, I hope my body doesn't look like her at the end of this. That's really tough to receive. And that, I want to call that out as something that can add an additional layer for anybody that struggled with body image before, is to be seeing this constantly out there as a very acceptable part of the pandemic, is this panic around our bodies and what they'll come out looking like.
Yeah, I can really see that. It's I think, as you know, I've never really had anything on my body in terms of kind of body image, which I know is very rare. And we were talking just before we started recording. I think that's got pretty much everything to do with my upbringing, that just, food and body image just wasn't a thing. And so kind of how I've ended up being is actually just innate to all of us if we weren't kind of like forced out of that way of relating to ourselves. Interestingly, it's only very recently I've realized that I won't go into this because it's kind of like a side note, but I just want to just share. I don't think any of us are kind of like probably immune to some form of this. For me, it's been around my face rather than my body. You could still say it's your body, but like very different to what we're talking about here. And I think I've only really recently realized the depth to which that has kind of like controlled me, and how much healing, as much as I have done work on that, like how much healing work I still have to do in that area. But it's really interesting how what you're describing, like seeing those posts, if you've got a relationship, like a negative relationship to your body, seeing those kind of posts is clearly going to be triggering.
Yeah.
Whereas to me, like it is like I don't even really like register it. Like it's just like I'm blind to it. But I was thinking like, but I really can understand. Like if there was a similar, it's hard to even imagine a kind of similar thing that would trigger me in that way. But like, wow, that's a lot to be with. And that's particularly so if it's someone not like you, for example, who you've done a lot of work to kind of, be able to like hold that level of feeling and work through it. Most people haven't. Most people are going to be subject to those images and be in a kind of real response to them.
Yes, and they are such a part of our culture, this messaging that we're given around our looks, particularly for women, and particularly specifically within our looks around weight, but I think it applies to more generally to body image, that to some degree we're also largely as a culture quite immune to it as well. So it's interesting, sort of my journey and what I see when I'm working with women through this is there's this sort of initial phase that might last for most of our adult lives where we're almost blissfully unaware of how this operates everywhere, and we're still affected by it, but our radar isn't tuned on. We just take it as a given. Like, isn't it a given that everybody wants to be thin? Isn't it a given that everyone's on a diet? Isn't it a given that everybody hates their body? It's sort of that's the rhetoric that kind of sits behind everything. And often sort of part of coming out of that is going, actually, hold on a second, this isn't right. And that's when almost, funnily enough, it's at that stage that it can feel most triggering, because we're suddenly aware of how it's everywhere.
Yes, I love that you've brought that in. So it's kind of, there's one place where we're just like so in the water we're swimming in. We're going to have a response to it, but it's going to be, I guess, so below our conscious understanding of kind of this is or isn't helpful, and just kind of put it all on us. And then there's a point where you start to have that elevation of seeing like, oh wow, like the whole narrative culturally here is not healthy.
Yes.
And yet I'm still going to, be in reaction to that because I'm human and I've still got the wounds I've got. It's really interesting you said that, because I was just thinking, although I'm probably quite blind to it, say, for example, in social media and stuff, because I'm not personally affected, I'm really conscious of that kind of narrative being introduced to my children. Like, obviously, because I'm really aware that's, like, I know it just doesn't even occur to me, but also I'm really aware that that's just like a really unhelpful thing to subject children to. But I'm hyper aware if one of my friends mentions like anything to do with like dieting, I don't know, putting on weight, anything like that, or even saying to my daughter something like about how slim and lovely she looks, like I really can feel this sense of like, oh, I just want to protect them from this. And I'll kind of react to it in different ways. But ultimately, I really notice that I am really attuned to it when it's my children. Like I really want to protect them from that.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? Yeah. And I love what you described there, because it's so innocuous often that we don't even realize. Like that is those people that are making those comments in such a well-intentioned way.
Yes, completely innocent.
It wouldn't even occur to them that wasn't something that you would want your daughter to hear.
Yes.
And it's so in the water that we just, a personal example jumped to mind there as we were talking, which is that when I've always quite enjoyed exercise and going to the gym. So I've had a long history of going to the gym. And when I was swimming in the water, I didn't really even realize, one of the first questions that would always be asked when I signed up to a new gym or with a new trainer was, what are your weight loss goals? And that was like a given. Like, of course, I'm going to the gym. Of course I have weight loss goals. And it took me so long to go, hold on a second, what? I don't have any weight loss goals. Actually, my goals are around feeling amazing and being strong and all of those things. And it's nothing to do with weight. And so for a period that grated on me. And in fact, I would walk, that sounds dramatic, but I walk out of gyms, but I would choose not to give my business to gyms where that was one of the first questions. And now I've gotten to that place where it's triggering, and I can have a really open conversation about why that might not be the best approach to take, to assume that everybody has those weight loss goals.
Yeah.
So it's just so in the water.
Really is. Wow. Okay. This has been I'm just like realizing all these other aspects to this that I've just, again, because it's not been a thing for me, I've just not had to consider it this deeply before. So yeah, fascinating. And then we were just looking back at kind of, again, this like what we're seeing being created.
Yeah.
It's like the perfect storm, really, isn't it? Like you've got people for very good reason eating in this kind of like emotionally soothing way. You've got all this kind of like shaming of like, oh my goodness, but if you do this is what you'll look like, and that's a bad thing. And then of course, like, where do people go from there? And so I guess let's just, in fact, obviously I know that some of your work is with clients specifically, like what does that look like for people right now, being subject to those two different experiences? Like what's that creating?
Well, and I want to speak to it, the third element to it before I go there, because that feeds into that really nicely, which is that on top of all of this, on top of these two huge things that are creating this perfect storm, is this primal fear that's getting activated as well around there not being enough. So I don't know if you had the experience of going to the grocery store and seeing an empty shelf. But I found it really fascinating. I went to our local grocer, it was probably about a month ago, and I walked into the pasta aisle and there was one packet of gluten-free lasagna sheets available. Everything else had been cleaned out. And the visual of there being no food activated this huge primal fear in me so strongly. And I was quite fascinated by it, because I knew logically that if I just turned to the right, there was other food that I could very easily have. I wasn't going to starve. But there was this real sort of fear of there's not enough. And what that triggers in us when we have this fear of there not being enough is this then counterbalance effect that makes a lot of sense given our biological history, is to binge or to feast, because there's a famine coming. You've had that experience of the restriction or the famine. And so that And that plays out at the sort of macro level that we might not even be aware of, when this thing of there not being enough and this sort of low level thing that's in the consciousness at the moment. But it also plays out at a micro individual level when we're looking at these two aspects. We're emotionally soothing with food or using food in a way that's not purely for fuel. And then we're worried about our bodies. So we're in this sort of double bind where we're constantly telling ourselves, I shouldn't be doing this. I shouldn't be doing this, but I am doing it, but I shouldn't be doing it. And what that tends to lead to is berating ourselves and then promising ourselves it'll be different tomorrow. And when we do that, we're creating a mental restriction in our mind, looping back into what do we do when we know that there's a restriction coming? We have this biological urge to feast, to binge. And so we get this restrict, binge cycle that plays out to varying degrees. Some people will identify that with that hugely, and for others it might be a little more nuanced, but it's that really biological, makes a lot of sense cycle that we can find ourselves in, and that I'm seeing a lot of people are in at the moment. They're doing this behavior that they don't want, but they don't know how to get out of it, and they're beating themselves up for it.
Yeah. It's so interesting. I just reflect that it all makes complete sense. And I was thinking, I don't think I've noticed it have that effect on me. But then, which, as you say, is primal. It's not a conditioned response like that. It's literally primal. But I was thinking, I think that's actually been true, not so much at the eating level, but at the kind of like, oh my gosh, have I got enough in my cupboards level? Where there's always enough. Like I tend to be someone who overbuys generally. Like I'm just not an empty cupboard type of person. And so even if we'd bought nothing extra, we probably could have easily passed through the time where there was like nothing in the shops. Like we would have been fine. And it was interesting noticing that kicking in at that level for me, where it's like, so I'm really aware the shops are selling out. Oh my goodness, I've only got this much pasta. I've only got this much rice. And realizing like that's how it didn't seem to kind of kick into it at an eating level, but it definitely did at a kind of scarcity level as to what was in my cupboards. And that's not something that we can, as you say, it's that primal fear that's activated. So it's not something we can logically talk ourselves out of. And that's why they're sort of trying to logically talk ourselves out of not having the chocolate or telling ourselves in the moment tomorrow is going to be different. That's our logical mind's trying to override what is a very primal response. Yes, definitely. Okay, that all makes sense. So what was coming up for me earlier when we were talking about emotional eating is I wonder if you feel this is the same or if there is some distinctions here. I was thinking how we're all going to have ways of soothing, aren't we? Like that's just, again, a kind of really necessary human response. You know, sometimes soothing ourselves is the right thing to do. And we've got ways of soothing that we've kind of deemed as acceptable and other ways that we've deemed as unacceptable. Some are kind of what you could describe as healthy, and it could be anything. It could be drinking more alcohol. It could be eating more. I noticed like I had 2 evenings right at the start of this where I was just doing this. Like I'm not generally someone who surfs much online. You know, like I tend to, like if I'm on Facebook, it will be because I'm responding to, I don't know, posts in one of my groups or something like that. I'm fairly quite organised and directed when I use social media. I'm not really a binger. And I noticed for 2 evenings, I was just like scrolling through Mumsnet posts, just mindlessly. And it was like, I really noticed, like, this is so interesting. It's not like me at all. And I'd like lay in the bath and I couldn't have enough focus to read a book, because that's my typical way. Like my way of soothing is reading, which is obviously culturally totally acceptable. So it kind of just goes under the radar. But it was like I couldn't even quite get enough attention to focus on a book. And notice that's what I was doing, just mindlessly consuming these posts on Mumsnet. And it kind of like, I suddenly realised that's what I'm doing. I'm like, how do I feel about that? I'm like, well, fine. That's clearly how I need to soothe right now. Go at it, girl. And so I did. So I just wonder what your thoughts are in terms of like, is that ultimately just we're all going to have a soothing mechanism, and it just happens that for some people, and again, partly because it might be their old soothing mechanism isn't available right now. If they were kind of typically, I don't know, if it was retail therapy, normally for them, they can't right now. But do you see there's any differences between different ways of soothing, or do you just see that's ultimately what's at play, and then we just put labels on different kinds?
Yeah, I love that example, because I think what you've spoken to there is the what's different about what tends to happen when people are using food to soothe themselves is that what we tend to do, so we've gotten our jar of Nutella, we're 5 mouthfuls in, and then we're almost mindlessly kind of consuming, and then we go, oh my God, and we sort of tend to have that moment. And what tends to happen then is that we don't do what you described, which is the check-in, like, oh wow, how do I feel about this? Like, what does this feel good to me right now? Does this feel like what I need? Does it? Yes. Carry on. Like if this jar of Nutella is feeling amazing, carry on. and that will often be the case. It's like, actually, I do want a bit more chocolate, or I do whatever it is. But we don't tend to do that when food is our soothing mechanism, because society has made that very wrong for us to use. It's probably on the very end of the spectrum as one of the. Although we all do it, it's sort of seen as very weak to use food as a soothing mechanism.
Yeah, in a weird way, I would say alcohol is more acceptable. And clearly when it tips over, like where we'd label it as alcoholism, it isn't. Yeah. But culturally, is much more acceptable to say, oh yeah, I'm just drinking more at this point. Yeah, like, you know, like I've seen so many comments on fellow mums threads about kind of trying to juggle homeschooling, and they'll be kind of like on the timetable, like 3 o'clock, have a glass of wine. Like that's just so more acceptable.
Absolutely. And people ordering cases of wine and that being hilarious, you know, that they're stocking up. Whereas if we had a case of chocolate delivered, there'd be a lot more charge around that.
Yes.
Absolutely. So because of that, because we've all got quite a lot of charge around eating as a soothing mechanism, both sort of collectively and individually usually, then we don't tend to do the stay in the present, check in what feels good with our body. What we tend to do is leap into the berating ourselves. I shouldn't be doing it. I can't believe I've done this again. I've got no willpower. And or usually both, we go into this has to stop. I can't, straight into the future. I can't do this anymore. And then, of course, as soon as we go into either of those, so we're either beating ourselves up and feeling worse, or we're telling ourselves that a restriction is coming, then it fuels us to want to eat even more. And that tends to be the using food to soothe ourselves. We still have that self-regulation mechanism in there if we don't override it. So we might have that chocolate, and then we notice this was so delicious and soothing at first, and now I'm starting to feel a bit sick. But we override that because of these where we lead to. Rather than, as you described in the bath, of kind of going, well, I'm doing this. How does this sit with me? Actually, it's exactly what I need right now. So carry on. Or equally, do you know what? It doesn't feel great. So I'm going to notice that and gently pivot and do something different without making myself wrong for it or telling myself that I can't do this tomorrow.
Yes, that makes complete sense. I mean, like with the Mumsnet example, I think I had 2 evenings of doing that. And just like once I'd accepted, like, this is clearly how I feel I need to soothe right now. And just kind of trusted it, like at some point, something else would appear. And I think it literally by the next night, it just didn't even seem like it was just gone from my system as like even needed. I think I don't know. I guess I was feeling like I didn't need soothing. There was no conscious choice. It was just like I noticed that had dropped away again. I can so see why the same would happen with food. And I think I was having a conversation with Eliane, Eliane, who's the parenting expert, about food, and it was actually primarily about technology, but she was saying the same applies to food. And so I want to ask you this question, because I find this quite fascinating, how when we're raising children to be very in touch with their own kind of intuition and instincts and sort of self-directed nature, like that works so well everywhere, potentially apart from two areas. One is technology and one is like junk food, because they're kind of things that we just haven't developed that instinctive way of being able to handle. And which makes a lot of sense to me. And everything she was talking about, I could see how I have taken a slightly different approach with both junk food and technology with my children, even though with every other area it's very kind of like self-guided. So it's kind of something we collaborate on rather than it being completely self-directed. So with that in mind, given the kind of addictive nature of both technology and some forms of, high sugar types of food, do you think there is, like, we say, for example, Mumsnet, there is clearly a psychological aspect, but there isn't a physically, I'm saying all this like it's black and white, it's not as black and white as this, but there isn't that kind of like, urge in my gut to kind of like consume more sugar. Do you think that's a distinction that's a concern when it comes to food that's not there with perhaps other things?
My sense of it is that it's overstated our lack of being able to regulate in that way. And, it's really interesting in the way that you were describing that, because you sort of presented the fact that we can get addicted to sugar or those sort of foods as a fact. And what's quite interesting is that there are a lot of dietitians, scientists, whatever, that would dispute that sugar is indeed addictive in the way that we have come to know addiction. So what a lot of the research around sugar as an addiction tends to focus on the effect that it has on our dopamine levels. And there are many other things that have that similar effect to our dopamine levels, like cuddling our dogs, for example. But we're definitely addicted to that. We're not addicted to that. And if we compare that, there's a lot of, I think one of the really common ones that went around was sugar is more addictive than heroin. Actually, when we look at clearly I'm not a scientist, this isn't my area of expertise, so I'm paraphrasing this here, but when we look at what happens when we physically withdraw from heroin, it's very different in the effect of our bodies compared to something like that. So there's I think there is a body of science that is convinced that we can be addicted to sugar. There's an equally loud voice within the scientific community that is disputing that fact. So I think as a general society, we tend to underestimate our ability for our bodies to tell us what they need. And I think what often happens is that we categorize ourselves as someone who cannot control themselves around food. So, it's great for you that you can do your moderation thing over there. But for me, I'm an all or nothing. I'm a black or white with food. I'm either good or I'm bad. I'm eating the whole packet of ice cream or I'm not having anything. And actually, when we kind of come back to what's really true is that I would say a huge proportion of that response is actually in response to the conditioning that we've created around it.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. In fact, Tim, I was sharing with you just before we started about mine and my husband's kind of different relationship to Easter eggs, where he very much sees himself as someone, if there's chocolate there, he has to eat it. And I'm like completely the opposite. So we're kind of week after we gave each other eggs, his were gone in the first 2 days, I think. I don't actually know. And he got me 3 eggs and I haven't even eaten one of them. Like I've eaten part of one of them. And it's like the same substance. If it was really that addictive, I would have eaten all of mine. And yet I can see them there every day. And like I'll have a bit if I fancy it and I won't if I don't. And I do think, it's actually true, I think, probably of any substance, really. There's not to say there isn't a kind of physically addictive quality of certain things, but I think there's always this deeper part of ultimately, I guess you could just say kind of what's going on for us at a deeper level, what we're what our wounds are, what our shadows are, kind of like what's driving that response, I think is far more important than anything we can actually kind of cram into our bodies in any of the ways we can do it.
Absolutely. And I think that what it comes back to is that in the absence of all this collective and individual wounding that we've had around food, usually from very young ages, most of us can recall getting very strong messaging about food and or our bodies. So that goes back so when we're so young. So we almost can't. There are very few people in the world, I think you being one of them, that has very little thinking and experience around that. So there aren't really many opportunities for us to look at, if we were in this vacuum where we didn't get any of these messaging around food and bodies, how would we relate to food? And my sense of it is that when I meet people like you that haven't had that really have kind of come from that pure background, that is just so innate, that ability to self-regulate and to trust your body around what it needs to fuel itself.
Yeah, I really agree with that. I was just thinking, maybe it's not the best example, but it popped up earlier when we were talking about the emotional eating and kind of like just trusting that if it's needed, then it's needed, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's just going to carry on out of control and you're never going to stop. And I was thinking, I think an example of that for me is, I think I've shared with you before, I typically fast in the mornings. Just because I think it is a kind of, it's nothing to do with weight at all. It's purely, it's like a really nice way of giving my body a rest from processing to do the kind of healing and sort of regeneration kind of work. And, but then some mornings I wake up and like for whatever reason, I just think, really fancy breakfast today. Yeah. And, sometimes it might just be, I'm feeling a bit low. Sometimes it might be that I actually feel hungry. Sometimes it might be menstrual and it just feels like, no, that's really what I need right now. Yeah. And so I have it. That's it. I just have it. Like there is no like, oh my God, if I break that thing where I'm in a habit of fasting, I won't be able to do that again. Or what if I just carry on eating after I've just I just don't have the thinking. Like it's of course right now, that's what my body would like to do. That's cool. Like my body gets like the biggest vote of all. Like that's cool. You go at it, body.
And I think that's the big difference between living in from your body and making choices from that perspective rather than the external, I'm on this plan that's telling me I need to do this, I'm on this plan, or I've got these restrictions that are coming. I'm waving my arms, which listeners can't see, but they're coming at us externally rather than being driven internally. And if we're being guided internally, what is right for us is going to change day to day. Yes, it doesn't make sense that we would be on this plan or following something that's dictating to us what we're going to need in that in that day or in that moment.
Yeah, it's just like another example of how we are trained culturally to look out there for answers instead of in here. And it, like that shows, having worked with me and having done Wake the Wild Feminine, like really very simply put, it's the work of like tuning back in. It just, this is another example of where we're so conditioned to look out like, oh, if I have the perfect plan, the perfect diet, the perfect this, the perfect that will save me, rather than recognizing like, no, the answers are always going to be coming from internally.
Yes. And really, starting to look in the direction of, what if it's not me? What if I'm not the problem? I'm not, I don't have, this lack of willpower. What if actually what's stopping me from being able to control, and I say that in inverted commas, my consumption of chocolate isn't me. It's all the conditioning that I've put on top of that that's getting in the way of my natural way of being.
Yeah, which it feels like to me, like, of course, but I also get that's like so not the narrative we're generally being told. Yeah. Wow. So we've, I'm just recognizing like this is such an interesting topic because Fat Rage is actually coming up towards the end of the show. So I think I know that we were really wanted to get into is recognizing that all of this is at play. Like we're not going to be able to just kind of remove that narrative from our culture. It's there.
Yeah.
How do we start to do the work of maintaining a good body image and and I think we've started touching on this, but kind of recognizing likely we will use food as a soother during this time. How do we not shame ourselves for it?
Yeah. And I think, we have touched on that point, which is really coming back into the present and noticing what feels good for my body now, like that constant tuning in, what would feel good, what does my body need in this moment, and noticing that our habitual response to using food as a soother will be to leap into it's going to be different tomorrow, or I shouldn't have done that. And even just seeing that as a habitual pattern, noticing whether you leap into one or the other or both, seeing that as that thing that I do can really help to take some of the charge out of it. And knowing that actually, thank goodness we have this soothing mechanism that works for us, because how would we survive these times if we didn't have access to something that allowed us to ground ourselves, to take a step out of that kind of huge overwhelming emotions that are out there at the moment. And we might also look at what other things soothe us, because I know for me, when I was in the depths of my eating disorder, food was the only thing that soothed me. And that was really what was problematic, was not so much that it was one of many mechanisms, but it was the only. So it's also starting to look at what other practices do I have in place that really support me, so that I have other soothing mechanisms that I'm also turned to, that come alongside, rather than making food wrong. They're also there, not trying to get rid of that one.
It reminds me of Marion Woodman, who I know I'm a fan of, because I've been sharing her stuff with you quite a lot recently. And I especially love her work, all to do with the body and addictions. And there's a number of things she says on this topic that I think is really wise and really correlates with what you're saying, which is, like for an example, she says that kind of craving for spirits, as in alcohol, is actually a craving for spirit. And I think she talks about kind of food as being like a wanting to feel kind of rooted and safe in the body. And I think recognizing that drive to, for example, have a connection with spirit or feel more safe and grounded in our body are like beautiful, pure urges. Like, who could make those wrong? They're beautiful. And there are a number of ways that we can create that too. Like there isn't just one way. And it's not to make it, I suppose like anything that's kind of out of balance because it's all one thing is probably less helpful than having a sense of kind of, there's a number of ways. Like the urge is beautiful. And there's actually a number of ways I can create that. It doesn't have to be all this one thing. Yes.
And there's something so beautiful about being able to see the purity and the innocence of that urge. So of course we're going to have those cravings and those urges in always, but particularly in times like this.
Yes.
It makes so much sense.
Really does. We'd be robots otherwise, wouldn't we?
Yes.
Yeah.
The other piece is around really starting to turn our radar on to everything that's going on in the ether and how this diet culture is just everywhere. And as soon as we start to turn our awareness to that, we can't unsee it. And that is incredibly powerful to start to see, wow, this messaging is constantly being fed everywhere I look. And then that tends to lead us to start to look at, where can I actually find some other new messaging that feels more true, more soul-led? And how can I start to celebrate body diversity in the way that we celebrate every other form of diversity? Why is it that there's one body type and that's the only area really where diversity isn't something that we're working towards as human beings? Really starting to look at what are where can I see those pockets that are different to the common view that's everywhere.
Yeah, that's so true. It's almost like the last taboo in a way, isn't it?
Yes.
in terms of kind of needing people to fit into a certain box to be acceptable. Yeah.
Yes.
It's not like we're all the way there with other types, but I feel like there's at least a much more collective agreement that that's the direction of travel to create that diversity. I think you're right. I don't think it's something, again, it's something that I'm not necessarily really attuned to in the way that you are, but I can really see what you're saying. It's not something we've collectively committed to working on.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's so true. Is there anything else you would, so I think that's I think with anything, agreeing to kind of just like agreeing with yourself to start to notice something, to bring it in your awareness is already like a hugely powerful step. Is there anything else that you would suggest as another step in that direction of really falling back in love with your body? I feel that that's what's actually possible for all of us. I feel there's this like almost like, yes, it's wonderful to move from having a really difficult relationship with your body to something neutral. But I really believe there is like something even more available, which is actually to like fall deeply in love with our bodies. And like, firstly, do you agree with that? And secondly, if you do, what would be another way that they could sort of take that next step in that direction?
Yes, I love that, because I'm super passionate about this actually, because in the body positive space where I spend a lot of my time, there is actually a rhetoric there that's sort of saying, well, the best we can hope for is sort of body acceptance in being body neutrality.
Yes.
And I actually
an important thing. It's just
Yes. Exactly. And that, that's certainly better than body hatred. And certainly that's been my journey. I hated my body for 20 years. Then I got to a stage where it wasn't a big deal, but the juiciness, the real, changes happened when I fell back in love with it. So 100% I believe it's possible, and that it's every human being's birthright to be completely at home and in love with their body. And so that's how I sort of describe it, is coming home to our bodies. Like, how can we really relish living in our bodies and really appreciating them? And so many different ways that we can do that. But the biggest thing is particularly for women, but I think this applies to men as well, is movement. So how can we come back into our bodies and move for pleasure? So, there's most of us will tend to be well versed in moving because we want to achieve something for a particular reason. We want to get fitter, we're training for something. This is all about coming into moving because it feels amazing, moving because it's what our body desires. So that might be through dance, it might be through, I know you've spoken before about the non-linear movement, where you're just allowing your body to move however it moves. So really coming back into that and introducing some form of short, it might be 5 minutes a day of movement practice to really be in your body.
I love that.
That's probably my favorite.
Yeah. I sometimes have clients ask me things like, well, for me, that's yoga. Is that okay? Does that count? And I think anything that is really like movement for movement's sake or movement for pleasure's sake is fine. But I think it's like doing the work to like recognize, like, am I really doing it for that? Or is this just another way to like make my body look more perfect or look better or fit the, like, if it's for that reason, then probably no, it doesn't count for what we're talking about here. That just pure moving because like, oh my goodness, like our bodies are amazing and they get to like move and express in all these like, wonderful ways.
And usually the way that we can tell if it is that is if it changes day to day. So for example, if we have a yoga practice and each day it's different, then that's probably a sense that we're moving according to what our body needs in that moment.
Yes.
Whereas if we're sort of going through our usual standard practice, then it might be an invitation to look at, actually, am I really responding to my body in the moment here, or am I going through the motions for specific purpose?
Oh, I love that. Yes, funny actually, a recent client who asked me that question about yoga, she uses it exactly the way you're talking about, where she'll notice like her movements will change from day to day, and kind of what she's discovering about her body and where there's tension held will change from day to day. And like for me, I use dance to find the exact same thing. And so it's like, it turns out the movement doesn't matter. We're both like allowing ourselves to kind of ebb and flow according to kind of like the needs of the moment, what our body wants to know in the moment.
And it might not even, yoga and dance still have that sort of quality to them. It might be, I've got a client that just gets outside, and some days she goes for a hardcore 10-kilometer run, and sometimes she walks around the block. And that's so it can look so different, but it, again, am I being responsive to what my body is calling for?
Yeah.
And even just starting to ask that question, what do you need, body? What would feel good right now? We're a big chunk of the way there in starting to come back into our body.
Oh, yeah. I remember I recorded an episode with Dominic Scafidi a few weeks ago, and it was on a completely different topic. He's very much into kind of law of attraction and that kind of stuff. But there was a bit where he said, and I got like proper like chills down my arms when he said it. He said something like, if we knew like how much we wanted to be in these bodies, like as in like when we're in spirit, like how much we choose, because we're so wanting the experience of these amazing bodies, like we'd have such a different relationship to them when we're down here in these bodies. And oh my God, I love that so much. Like I just had this like thrill go through me, like, oh my gosh, yeah, like I chose this because it was like I wanted this experience of being in this amazing body.
Oh my God, I can feel tears welling up as you say that, because I honestly thought I was in the wrong body, that there had been a mistake. My body was wrong for so many years. And so to come to that place where you go, there's no mistake. This body is yours and it's perfect, and it's to be relished and lived in and appreciated and seen for the juiciness that it is just, it still moves me to tears, because exactly that. I felt for so many years that it was all wrong.
Yeah. What a perfect place to end this. Oh my goodness. This has been gorgeous. So Jess, I know you're pretty active on social media, and where's the best place for people to go find out about you, all the gorgeous content you share, and how to work with you?
Yeah, brilliant. So I'm on Instagram, and I share a fair bit on there, talking about all of these types of topics. And my website is the best place to get information about how to work with me. I run a program called Come Home to Your Body, which is all about this juicy part of really coming into partnership and trust with your body. And so it's jessheading.com is my website.
Wonderful. Oh my goodness. Thank you so much, Jess. I really feel, this has been really enjoyable, but I'm really hoping this will be a very, exactly what people need right now. It's perfect.
I hope so. And I love talking about this topic. So thank you very much for this opportunity.
Wow. What a wonderful show that was. Here are my takeaways. Eating is one way we can soothe, and we don't need to make ourselves wrong for that. If that's what we need, it's perfect. And there are other ways to meet that same underlying need too. Notice the mainstream narrative. It's the water that we're swimming in, which makes it hard to see. But once we start to see it with a bit more altitude, we can look for other narratives. One of the most powerful ways you can fall in love with your body is to allow it to move in ways that feel good to you. One of the practices I offer women in both Wake and Wild Feminine and again in Unwrapping the Body is a practice of body-led movement. And oh my goodness, it is probably the single most powerful practice that women can do. It really is. So if you'd like to get notes and links for everything we spoke about this week, hop on over to the show notes, and they're at primalhappiness.co/episode 281. And if you don't want to miss out on next week's episode, head on over to Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Stitcher, or your Android or iOS app of choice and hit subscribe. That way you'll get each episode straight to your device as soon as it comes out. And if you want to give back to us in some way, please just let others know about this show. If you think there might be other people that might enjoy the range of topics, the depth of conversation, let them know about the show too. Thank you so much for listening. You've been wonderful. Catch you again next Tuesday.